So what are some of the experiments and trials that you've put forward to really sort of dispel this myth or at least test the hypothesis that you don't
Yeah.
need carbohydrates as an athlete?
So when Philip Prince approached me he's from Grove City College in Pennsylvania, which I see is quite it's a small college, but it's highly rated in America. And he just happens to have an amazing laboratory, and he can do clinical trials on runners and cyclists with great results. They're just very good at doing that work. And all he needed was a direction. So what research should we do? So he asked me, I said, well, why don't we test the high fat, high carb diet, high fat diet by putting people on a high carb diet for 6 weeks or so, and then having them do a performance trial, and then reversing that and putting them on a high fat diet for 6 weeks. And of course, we didn't do all of them at the same time. We broke them in half, etc., because that's the only way you can do it. So we do these randomized controlled trials, and we started at 5 kilometers. So I said, well, can you do reproducible 5K time trials on the treadmill in your laboratory? He said, yes, we get very good results. So I said, okay, well, let's do 5K time trials on these guys. And so we did. And we also did VO2 max tests before on the different diets. And guess what? VO2 max was exactly the same. And the 5K time trial was exactly the same, the performance. So the performance didn't change. So then I said, yeah, but what they're going to say is that it's because the guys still had some glycogen. Even though you're on a high fat diet, you still got enough glycogen to run 5Ks. I said, let's put the intensity of the exercise up and then do an activity which will produce muscle glycogen depletion. So we said, right, let's make it a 1 mile time trial. So we put the speed up to the 1 mile, and then they did the same experiments. And there was no difference again. The performance was identical. So those people eating a high-fat diet can run 1 mile just as fast whether they're eating carbs or fat. And then I said, okay, fine, let's do 6 times 800 meter intervals, because everyone knows that that's going to deplete your glycogen. So even if they start with some glycogen, by the third or fourth, they're going to have no glycogen left, and they're just going to fall over and not be able to exercise. So, of course, that didn't happen. The performance was identical for the 6 times 800 meter repetitions. And then by chance, because I didn't tell Philip to do this or suggested it, he measured oxygen consumption while they were doing the intervals. And we measured the fat oxidation rates. Now, the textbook says the following, and this is the Bible that I taught for 40 years, that there's a so-called crossover point, that as you increase your exercise intensity, you reach a point where you can only burn carbs. You can't burn fat. And that's usually at 85% VO2 max. And that idea was developed by a great friend of mine, George Brooks, who taught me so much. He helped us. When we did the studies of carbohydrate metabolism, we used tracers, and he was the expert on tracer methodology in the world. And he came to Cape Town and he showed us how to do it, and we've been friends ever since. So it's not as if I wanted to go out and disprove him at all. That was never the goal. We just happened to find this. So what we discovered was that when they ran the 6 times 800 meter intervals, they were running at 86% VO2 max. By chance, God came along and said, it's 86% VO2 max. So they were 1% over, and so they should have been burning zero fat. They burnt the highest rates of fat oxidation ever recorded in humans in history. Nice. 1.5 grams per minute, it is enormous. I mean, that provides 3/4 of the energy to run a sub-2-hour marathon just by burning fat. So why do you need carbs? So anyway, that was what we found. And so that really was very exciting. But while we were doing that, we were doing another experiment, and I'm not going to give you the full results because it's not been published. Mm-hmm. But then I'll tell you what we did. You see, so we now had a model where we could change muscle glycogen before the start of exercise. And we had found that it made no difference running at those distances. So I said, okay, well, let's now do a long, prolonged exercise so that the guys get out and cycle at 70% of the VO2 max or whatever, and they go for as long as they can. And we're going to have them start with more muscle glycogen or less muscle glycogen because they followed the diets. And then we're going to give them just enough glucose, just enough to make sure that the blood glucose doesn't fall. Not enough to modify the metabolism, just enough to keep their glucose normal. And I had worked this out because it became apparent to me that in all these studies of carbohydrate metabolism and muscle glycogen depletion, no one was worried about the blood glucose level. They just ignored it. And I noticed that a lot of the studies, the blood glucose levels were low, including in the famous Bergstrom study, which is the one on which the whole thing is based. They took people, they put them on a high carbohydrate diet, had them exercise for as long as they could, and they found that the more carbohydrate in the muscle, the longer you could last for. And they said, you see, therefore, it's all muscle glycogen. But what they ignored was that everyone became, blood glucose levels dropped. They just ignored it.
Mm.
But the reality is, up to 1939, the teaching in sports science was that hypoglycemia, a falling blood glucose, is what causes fatigue.
Mm.
And that was the model. And it was said it's a brain effect. How do I know this? Because it was written in German, two famous writers, Christensen and Hansen, but they published it in German and no one bothered to read the articles. So I had the articles translated by a friend of mine who's a German. And he translated the sections, and there it said, what happens is when you take glucose, if you're tired, you take glucose and your performance goes up. It's just correcting your blood glucose level. It's got nothing to do with metabolism in the muscles, nothing at all. And they presented all the evidence for that. So that was the model. The model was falling blood glucose, your brain cuts in and says, I can't continue to exercise or your blood glucose is going to go low and the brain's going to be damaged. So you must stop exercising. Mm-hmm. And that's the logical solution. So as I was working through it, I noticed that there were some studies where minimum amounts of carbohydrate improved performance. You didn't have to take huge amounts.
Yeah.
So that was the experiment we did. And we've done the studies and they're about to be submitted, in which we compared what must you do? Must you take carbohydrate during exercise or before exercise? And the key was that before exercise, the people every day were taking, let's say, 300 or 400 grams of carbohydrate more. And what effect did that have on performance? That's the question. But during exercise, they only took 10 grams an hour. So they took 20 grams. During a 2-hour experiment, they took 20 grams of carbohydrate. Now, everyone will tell you, oh, it's the 400 grams before exercise that makes a difference, and not the 20 grams during exercise. Well, let's see what the results showed.
Yeah.
Because they might bring some nice, exciting surprises.
Yeah, very good. And then so have you done a comparison or seen a comparison done with, I mean, because obviously you looked at carbohydrate athletes and zero carbohydrate athletes. Well, what about that middle ground where you have a ketogenic athlete that you just give them, 10, 20 grams of carbs? Does that make a difference in performance, or does it still stay the same if you're keto adapted?
Yeah, so the benefit of keto adaptation is that you can exercise with at much lower blood glucose levels. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge advantage. And we have answered your question, and I can't answer it because it's not been published. So
okay,
so,
we'll wait for that.
However, but I've always considered that it's the ultra exercise, the Ironman and so on, where you'll really get the benefits. Because when your glucose starts to fall, that's the one thing that if you're keto adapted, you won't notice it and you'll continue to exercise vigorously. So that's the one difference. And we are involved with another group in Australia, and they're looking at high fat diets and more prolonged exercise, including marathons and ultra marathons. And I think that's where the low carb diet will really be beneficial. So we've looked at very little exercise, small amounts of exercise, just 2 hours. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you at 2 hours, what you eat before exercise makes no difference whatsoever. None at all.
Yeah.
And that's a breakthrough. But the other breakthrough is, when do you need your carbs? When do you need to take them? And you do need them.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you put 2 and 2 together, you'll know what I'm saying, but I can't say it yet.
Yeah.